She stood at the edge of the sidewalk, arms crossed, lips tight, and fire in her eyes. "This is my neighborhood," she snapped. Her voice echoed off the stucco walls and well-manicured lawns like it was law. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't even begin to imagine, was that the quiet, gentle old man she was yelling at had deeds to every home within her sightline. Every head she'd walked past, every porch she'd waved to, every little park bench where she sipped her overpriced coffee, they all belonged to him. And she had just picked a fight with the one person who built her entire world. But let's rewind to the morning it all began. It was early spring when Grandpa returned to his old block. 78 years old, slow but sturdy, cane in hand and wisdom in his gaze. The sun was soft that morning, light trickling through the trees like something out of a postcard. He pulled up in a rusted navy blue truck, the kind with a manual crank window and a broken radio stuck on one station. He parked it across the street from the house he was born in. Not lived in, born in. Back when Bobbies came into the world in bedrooms, not hospitals. Back when neighbors brought pies and didn't throw lawsuits. Grandpa Joe wasn't back for sentiment. He wasn't chasing memories. He was back because for the first time in decades, the entire neighborhood, his neighborhood, was on the brink of being sold off piece by piece. Developers were circling like vultures, and the town council was one vote away from rezoning it into a luxury strip mall. That wasn't going to happen, not on his watch, not while the deeds still bore his signature. He had inherited the land from his father, who had purchased it plot by plot back in the 1940s after returning. And this was just day one. By the next morning, Karen was on a mission. She didn't sleep much the night before, not with a stranger's rusty truck still parked outside, right across from her perfect porch. Her eyes twitched with irritation as she sipped her oat milk latte and stared out the window, watching Joe's truck like it was a threat to her carefully curated world. She had no idea who he was, and that unknown rattled her more than she cared to admit. In her mind, control was everything. And control started with knowing every person on the block. Joe didn't fit the mold, so she was going to fix it. She typed furiously into the HOA Facebook group, one she had started herself. "Police car light, suspicious activity alert. Man parked across the street from my home refused to identify himself. Maybe trespassing, possible squatter. Be aware, police car light." The reactions came flooding in. A few neighbors chimed in, agreeing that they had seen someone unfamiliar walking around. Others suggested calling the police. Karen liked those comments the most. But across the street, Joe wasn't on Facebook. He was sitting at the Simmons kitchen table, sipping weak coffee with a grin. Old jazz played faintly in the background, and for the first time in years, Simmons looked like he was home. The two old friends hadn't seen each other in decades, but time hadn't dulled their bond. They spoke in half sentences, memories spilling over each other like dominoes. Joe had come with more than just stories, though. He had a plan. He pulled out a faded leather briefcase and set it gently on the table. Inside were yellowed papers, envelopes sealed with wax, and old black and white photographs. One by one, he laid them out: deeds, tax documents, lease agreements, letters from his father. Some of them dated back nearly 80 years. Joe had brought proof of something very few people ever truly possess: legacy. "I'm not just here to visit," Joe said, eyes focused and steady. "They're trying to take this place, bulldoze it, build coffee shops and condos and call it progress. But this street, it's our story. My dad built this block from dirt, and I'm not letting them erase him." Simmons nodded slowly. His own house, small, crooked, patched together with more memories than money, was on the list of properties targeted for development. But until now, no one had stood up to the growing pressure. No one had reminded the neighborhood who really held the roots beneath the pavement. Joe planned to do exactly that. Outside, Karen wasn't wasting time either. She marched down to City Hall with her clipboard in hand and her sunglasses shielding her indignation. She requested records on every home on the block, confident she'd find something, anything, to prove that Joe didn't belong. She was the queen of loopholes, always ready to use a technicality as a weapon. But when the clerk returned with the files, something strange happened. The clerk muttered. "Looks like most of these are owned by Joseph H. Maxwell Trust." Karen blinked. "What do you mean most?" "Well, actually, all of them. Every property on that side of the block and a few on yours too. Looks like they were consolidated decades ago. One owner." Karen's throat went dry. She stared at the name. Joseph H. Maxwell, the same name that had been on that rusty mailbox she mocked. The same signature etched into the papers she tried to challenge. That man, that old man, wasn't trespassing. He was returning, and worse, he was in charge. Back on the street, Joe stepped outside just as Karen pulled up. Their eyes locked, hers full of forced composure, his calm unreadable. She approached slowly this time, not with barking orders but with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hello again," she said. I didn't realize you were staying in the neighborhood." Joe gave a polite nod, planning to, got some things to take care of. Karen tucked her clipboard behind her back. Well, I hope everything's in order. We try to maintain a certain standard around here. Joe looked around slowly at the old trees, the cracked sidewalks, the paint-chipped porches. I think the standard been just fine for about 70 years, he said, voice steady. Karen's face twitched. Of course, I just meant if there's anything you need help with, I'm on the board. Joe smiled faintly. I'm familiar with boards. She left quickly after that, but her mind was racing. She couldn't figure him out. He wasn't loud, he wasn't confrontational, but he wasn't bending either. And for the first time since moving here, someone wasn't impressed by her title, her tone, or her threats. She thought she ran this block, she thought she could mold it. But now she was realizing she may not even know who owned it. Joe sat back on the porch of the Simmons house as the sun dipped behind the rooftops. He wasn't here to fight, not yet, but Karen had made one thing clear: she wasn't backing down, and that meant Joe would have to do what he hadn't done in years, stand his ground, not with anger but with the quiet strength of history. She saw a stranger, but soon the neighborhood would remember the man who never left, because some people don't just live on a block, they are the block. It wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a battleground now. The battle wasn't fought with fists or fire, but with words whispered at coffee shops, glares exchanged across picket fences, and tension thick enough to slice through. Karen had unknowingly drawn the first sword, and Joe had been holding the shield for decades, but now it was time to start swinging back. By midweek, flyers began showing up in mailboxes, black and white, simple font, no fancy logos. Community meeting Thursday night at the old church hall. The signature at the bottom, Joseph H. Maxwell. Most of the neighbors hadn't heard that name in years. Some didn't know it at all, but the older ones, their eyes lit up like a light had been switched back on. They remembered the Maxwell family. They remembered the man with the quiet walk and the generous rent. The man who never raised his voice but never missed a funeral. To them, Joe's name was a promise. Karen got one of the flyers too. She nearly crumpled it but stopped. Her pride told her not to care. Her curiosity didn't listen. That night she texted her group chat, "Anyone going to this so-called meeting?" Responses trickled in. "Is it a protest?" "Joe, that's the guy with the truck, right? My grandma says he used to own the entire street." Karen clenched her jaw. She wasn't used to being upstaged. She was used to being the one who hosted meetings, who printed flyers, who told the stories. But now an old man had suddenly become the center of a neighborhood she thought was hers. When Thursday night came, the church hall filled up faster than expected. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of old neighbors and new faces. Teenagers sat in the back with arms crossed. Moms hushed crying toddlers. And at the front stood Joe, button-down shirt, suspenders, and a stack of worn papers. He didn't use a microphone, he didn't need one. His voice carried the kind of gravity that didn't need volume to make an impact. "I know many of you don't know me," he began, "but I know this place and I know you." He told stories, not speeches, stories of barbecues from the 70s, the time old Mr. Baxter saved a boy from drowning in the creek, how the oak tree near the corner house was planted in memory of a girl lost too young. He reminded them that this block wasn't just property, it was history. Every sidewalk, every garden, every squeaky gate had a name and a story. And slowly the room began to nod. He laid out what was happening, the developers, the rezoning, the offers already on the table for certain homes, and then he opened his briefcase again and showed the papers, the ownership, the dates, the signatures. "I'm not here to tell you what to do," he said, "but I'm not selling, and if you want to keep this place a neighborhood, not a shopping center, then we've got work to do." The applause didn't explode, it simmered like a pot warming on a stove, steady, real. Karen stood in the back, arms folded. Her face didn't change, but her eyes did. She didn't see an old man anymore, she saw an anchor. And in that moment she realized she was in trouble. Because while she had been building a house here, Joe had built roots, and roots always run deeper than fences. The next morning, the tone in the neighborhood shifted. People waved more, kids played louder. A few porch lights stayed on longer. Joe didn't just remind them who owned the block, he reminded them what it meant to belong. And suddenly, Karen's clipboard didn't seem as powerful. But Karen wasn't done. She had a plan of her own, a final card she hadn't played yet, one that would question Joe's claims, one that could dig into the past and twist it, because if she couldn't fight Joe's legacy, she'd try to tarnish it. And she already had a friend at the county records office. What Karen didn't understand, what she never could, was that the strength of a man like Joe didn't come from paper. It came from decades of silent doing, of standing by people when no one else did, of giving without expecting. And when people like Joe are challenged, they don't fall apart. They reveal how deeply they've been holding everyone else together. The war for the block had just begun. Karen had never liked losing. In her world, losing meant weakness, and weakness was a crack she refused to show. So after the community meeting, when Joe stood tall like the block's returning king and everyone started whispering his name with reverence, Karen felt the walls close in. She didn't understand how one man with dusty papers and quiet confidence could unravel years of her carefully manicured control. But she wasn't about to give up, not without a fight. And certainly not to a man whose name was only just starting to echo in her circles. She made the call the next morning. "Hi, I need a full audit on the Joseph H. Maxwell Trust," she said to a contact she'd once helped dodge a property fine. "And anything that shows inconsistency in ownership, liens, gaps, back taxes, I want everything." It wasn't just petty, it was strategic. Karen knew perception was everything. If she could cast even a shadow of doubt over Joe's claim to the neighborhood, she could slow the momentum he was building, make people hesitate, maybe even divide them. She was a master of whispers, and whispers often did more damage than any shout ever could. While she plotted, Joe kept walking the block, visiting old friends, reintroducing himself to new neighbors. He offered to repaint a fence, helped carry groceries, spoke gently with a single mother who'd been thinking of selling. He didn't preach, he just showed up. And in doing so, reminded people that communities weren't saved in courtrooms, they were saved on porches and sidewalks. But whispers, like weeds, grow quietly. One morning, Joe found an anonymous letter in his mailbox. It was typed, cold, impersonal. It read, "How can we trust a man who's been gone for so long? Who's to say he really owns anything anymore? What if he's just clinging to something that isn't his?" Joe folded the letter carefully and tucked it back inside the envelope. He didn't need to guess who had written it. The intent was clear. Karen was planting seeds of doubt. She was hoping the roots of community would rot from the inside. But Joe wasn't new to this kind of battle. Later that day, he walked into the county recorder's office with the same briefcase he carried into the community meeting. But this time, it wasn't just deeds and titles, it was his father's journal. Faded handwriting on lined pages chronicling every purchase, every handshake, every promise made on that street. Each page was a map of memory, a testament to work, sweat, and faith. He met with the clerk and requested certified copies of all current ownership records. He wasn't afraid of scrutiny, he welcomed it. If Karen wanted paperwork, he'd bury her in truth. Meanwhile, Karen received an email. Subject line, "Requested files attached." Her heart jumped as she clicked. Dozens of PDFs. Legal files, ownership logs, tax documents going back to 1952, and then something she didn't expect. A scanned letter from a former tenant dated 1996. It read, "To Mr. Joseph H. Maxwell, thank you for keeping my rent affordable after my husband died. I don't know where my kids and I would be without you. You may be the landlord, but you've always treated us like family." Karen's hand hovered over her mouse. She closed the file. For a brief second, doubt cracked through her armor. But pride is a powerful drug. The next day, she distributed her own flyers. "Do you really know who owns your home?" the headline blared. Beneath it were questions, carefully phrased, legally vague, but emotionally loaded. "Was your deed ever transferred correctly? Have your property taxes been directed to the right entity? Who holds power of attorney over your lease?" The community was shaken, not all of them, but enough. Some looked at Joe differently now, not with suspicion, but uncertainty. Doubt once planted spreads faster than truth. Joe saw the change, and it stung. That night, he sat alone on the Simmons porch. The neighborhood was quiet, porch lights flickered on. Distant laughter from a barbecue floated through the air. He watched it all silently, remembering the block he grew up on. A block where people didn't question your word if your hands were dirty from helping them move in. A block where legacy wasn't just about paper, it was about people. Karen watched from across the street. For the first time, she wasn't angry. She was afraid. Afraid that no matter how hard she tried, she could never manufacture what Joe had built. Authority, she had that. Influence, she could craft it. But legacy couldn't be bought, and certainly not forged. Joe stood slowly, the night breeze rustling his collar. His eyes locked with Karen across the road. No words, just a long, quiet gaze. Because war wasn't declared with screams. Sometimes it was declared with silence, and a man who refused to move. Everyone has a breaking point. For Joe, it wasn't the anonymous notes or the legal whispers Karen spread like poison ivy. It wasn't even the way the neighborhood began to second-guess his presence. No, what finally cracked something deep in his chest was the look on little Maddie's face, that same wide-eyed boy he'd helped fix his bike the week before. Matty used to wave from his porch with pure joy, but now, as Joe passed by, the boy hid behind his mother's legs, not out of fear, but confusion. That moment hit Joe harder than any lawsuit ever could. He wasn't fighting for property. He was fighting for trust, for memory, for the soul of a place that had quietly raised generations, and now that soul was being chipped away one seed of doubt at a time. But Karen had gone too far this time. She didn't stop at flyers. Her latest move was bold, reckless, even. She filed a formal motion with the city to review property tax allocations and challenge the validity of Joe's ownership trust. On the surface, it sounded procedural, but beneath it, it was war. Joe received the notice in the mail 2 days later, a thick packet of legal language and bureaucratic tone. Most men would have flinched, most would have folded. Joe instead reached for his father's journal. The next morning, he called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, Clara Reynolds, a woman Joe once gave his lawn mower to when her father passed away. She had grown up on the block, played tag under his oaks, cried on his porch when she didn't make the school play. Now, she was a respected property rights attorney in the city. When Joe showed up at her office, she hugged him like family. "You shouldn't be dealing with this alone," she said. He handed her the file. She flipped through the documents, the trust paperwork, the registered deeds, the notarized letters from tenants past and present. "Karen doesn't have a case," Clara said firmly. "She's throwing sand in the wind, hoping it blinds someone before it blows back in her face." But Joe knew better. It wasn't about winning in court. It was about surviving in hearts. "She's winning them over," he said softly, "not with truth, with doubt." Clara nodded. "Then let's give them truth they can feel." That night, Joe did something he hadn't done in decades. He invited the entire block to his childhood home. The house hadn't been lived in for years, just maintained out of habit and memory. He dusted off furniture, opened windows, and lit up the porch like it was a holiday. Word spread fast. Curiosity, if nothing else, drew people in. They came slowly at first, a few neighbors, then families, then old faces Joe hadn't seen since he left town. By sundown, the house was alive again, laughter bouncing off the walls, the scent of cobbler baking in the oven, music playing on a record player older than most of the kids running barefoot through the hallway. And then Joe did something unexpected. He opened the living room wall. Behind a false panel, tucked carefully and preserved in glass, were the original land purchase agreements, signed by his father, notarized, dated, framed alongside photographs of the very first families to move onto the block: black, white, Latino, veterans, immigrants, all united by a dream and by one man's vision of what a neighborhood could be. "This isn't mine," Joe said to the room. "It never was. I've just been keeping it safe." The silence was thick with reverence. People didn't clap, they nodded, they understood. Across the street, Karen watched from her window. She had received an invite, folded it, and dropped it in the trash. She hadn't expected anyone to go, but now, watching the glow from the house, the hum of real joy drifting across the street, something in her chest twisted, not anger, not fear, something worse. Loneliness. Because for all her rules and meetings and HOA bylaws, she had never created what Joe had protected: community. The next morning, something changed. Mr. Simmons added a sign in his yard: "We stand with Maxwell." By noon, 3 more followed. By evening, over a dozen homes bore the same message. Karen paced in her kitchen, clutching her mug like it owed her answers. Her control was slipping, not because Joe fought back, but because he didn't have to. All he did was show people who they already were. All he did was remind them. And now, the block wasn't just standing behind him. It was rising. The signs went up like wildfire. "We stand with Maxwell" in hand-painted letters, some crooked, some bold, but everyone placed with purpose. Joe didn't ask for them. In fact, when he saw the first one on Simmons' lawn, his eyes misted with the kind of emotion that only comes from seeing decades of quiet sacrifice finally acknowledged. This wasn't about property lines anymore. This was about belonging. And Joe wasn't just a landlord now, he was the heart of the block. But for Karen, each new sign felt like a personal attack. Every porch that bore those words looked like a traitor. Every wave that used to come her way now passed her by, headed instead to Joe, who smiled warmly and tipped his weathered hat like a gentle king. She doubled down. Karen launched a neighborhood petition, not just the passive kind. She titled it "Preserve the Standards, Say No to Interference." It was legal sounding neat, packaged with buzzwords about safety and property value. But underneath it all, it was one final attempt to push Joe out. She framed it like a defense of modern values against outdated nostalgia. And she made sure to highlight Joe's absence for the past few decades, painting him as an outsider who'd suddenly returned with claims and sentiment instead of real authority. But something had changed. People weren't as quick to sign. Karen knocked on doors and was met with polite refusals. Some didn't open the door at all, others just smiled and said, "We're with Maxwell." It stung. She told herself she didn't care. But that night, she walked the street alone, past windows glowing with dinner and laughter and soft music, things she'd never realized were happening without her. At the corner house, she paused. Joe was on the porch again, rocking slowly in a wooden chair. Across from him sat Maddie, that same little boy who once hid behind his mom. Now he was laughing at a story Joe was telling, eyes wide with wonder, no fear at all. Joe handed him a harmonica, showing him how to hold it. The boy blew a few notes and giggled. Karen stood in the shadows, watching. She felt something break inside. And it wasn't defeat. It was envy. Joe didn't take control, he earned respect. He didn't push anyone to join him, they simply remembered who he was, that he had been here long before she ever arrived, that while she handed out fines, Joe handed out help. She had tried to mold the neighborhood into her image. Joe had simply reminded it of its soul. The next morning, Joe received a letter. Another formal envelope, but this one different. It was from the city council. The review of his trust and ownership claims had concluded. Everything was valid. Every deed, every signature, every document, airtight. The council not only dismissed Karen's challenge but reaffirmed Joe's full property rights in a public record. Clara, his lawyer, called with a smile in her voice. "You're officially untouchable, Mr. Maxwell." Joe chuckled. "I wasn't worried." But he knew what it meant. The final shot had been fired, and it missed. Later that afternoon, Joe walked down the block with that familiar steady step. He didn't gloat, he didn't grandstand, he just visited the same porches he'd always known, thanked people for their support, asked about their kids, admired the flowers on Ms. Diaz's steps. When he passed Karen's house, he paused. She was watering her roses, though her grip on the hose was tense. Their eyes met. Joe nodded gently. Karen said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't look away, and for a moment the air between them wasn't angry, it was just tired. She had tried to reshape a place with rules and pressure. But Joe had simply been the place. And now even Karen couldn't deny it. That night, Joe sat on his porch under a canopy of stars. The block was quiet, peaceful. Somewhere down the street, kids laughed, a dog barked once, then fell silent. He leaned back, closed his eyes. He hadn't just returned to defend the neighborhood. He had reminded it how to breathe. And it was breathing again. The sun rose slower that morning, like even the sky knew something had shifted. The block was quiet, but not the kind of silence that comes with tension. This was something softer, calmer. The storm had passed, and what remained was the kind of stillness you only get after a long fight is finally over. Joe sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, steam rising like the memories in his chest. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. This wasn't a victory lap. This was home. Across the street, Karen stood behind her curtains. She had barely slept the night before, not because she was angry, but because for the first time since moving to the block, she was thinking, really thinking, about the meetings, the fines, the rules, the way she had measured her worth by how many people she could control rather than how many she could connect with. And she thought about Joe, the man she tried to erase, the man who never raised his voice, who never fought dirty, who never struck back. And yet he won. But the truth was, Joe hadn't come back to win. He came to preserve. That afternoon, something unexpected happened, a knock on Joe's door, slow, unsure. He opened it to find Karen standing there. No clipboard, no sunglasses, just her, real, a little smaller than usual. "Can I sit?" she asked. Joe nodded and stepped aside. They sat on the porch in silence for a while. The air between them felt strange, fragile, like a window you don't want to touch too hard. "I didn't come here to apologize," Karen finally said. "I just wanted to say thank you." Joe glanced at her, one brow raised. She looked down at her hands. "You reminded this place what it was, and I didn't realize how much I needed that too." Joe didn't reply right away. Instead, he watched a squirrel dart across the power line and disappear into a tree. Then he spoke. This block raised me, it raised a lot of us. My dad taught me something before he passed. He said you can own land, but land never really belongs to a man. It belongs to the memories people make on it, the lives built on it, the kids who fall and scrape their knees on its sidewalks. Karen looked up at him. I never meant to tear that down. No, Joe said softly, you just forgot to look. The silence returned, but it didn't feel awkward anymore. It felt like two sides of a war finally realizing they were standing on the same battlefield for different reasons. Karen stood. If you ever need help with anything, just ask. Joe didn't say thank you, he just nodded again because that's what he did. He gave space. He gave people the room to remember who they were before pride and pressure and power got in the way. And Karen. She walked away slower than she came, but lighter. A week later, a new sign appeared on her lawn. It didn't say we stand with Maxwell. It said proud to be part of this block. That one made Joe smile. The neighborhood changed after that, not in big ways, but in subtle ones. Kids played later, neighbors brought over pies without being asked. Fences were mended not because they needed fixing, but because people cared again. It was the kind of shift you couldn't measure in zoning laws or court documents, but you could feel it every time someone said hello without looking over their shoulder. Joe kept the house, never rented it, never sold it. He said it needed to be there even if it was empty, like a book you keep on the shelf not to read again but to remember the story. And every so often someone would leave flowers on the porch. No note, just a thank you in the quiet way people like Joe understand. Because in the end, the block didn't need a new beginning. It just needed to remember its roots. And thanks to one man's quiet return and one woman's hard-earned awakening, it finally did.